Unaware she was a billionaire's granddaughter, she sold everything to send her sister to London. Then her husband dumped her in a shelter after her baby shower. But what happened months later left him speechless. Nobody at the baby shower knew they were standing in the same room as a billionaire's granddaughter. Not her friends, not the women who had brought second-hand gifts wrapped in dollar store paper. Not the husband who sat in the corner with his jaw tight and his eyes cold, already planning what he would do before sunrise. And certainly not her, because she was unaware. She had spent her entire life being unaware. Unaware of who her grandfather was, unaware of what her bloodline carried, unaware that the sacrifices she made were being watched by forces far greater than she could see. She had sold everything to send her sister to London. Everything. The kind of everything that leaves a woman sleeping on a mattress on the floor, eating one meal a day, and wearing the same shoes through 2 seasons, because her sister's dream mattered more than her own survival. That was her sin, if love can ever be a sin. But the night of her baby shower, the warmth she had waited for her whole life was ripped away in a single sentence. Her husband dumped her in a shelter. Not gently, not privately. He made sure she felt every inch of the fall. And there, in that shelter, cold, alone, her baby pressing against her ribs, like a reminder that she still had something worth protecting. Something shifted, something ancient. Something that had been waiting in her bloodline for decades finally began to move. Months later, he came looking for the woman he had thrown away. And what he found left him so speechless that the words he had rehearsed dissolved before they reached his lips. But who told her the truth about her grandfather? What did her sister in London discover? And when the billionaire's granddaughter finally claimed what was hers, what did she do with the man who had abandoned her with his child? She had never once asked the world for anything. And the world, having noticed this, had taken full advantage of her silence. Her name was Eleanor Briggs, and on the morning she carried the last box out of her apartment, the apartment she had spent 4 years filling with small, careful acts of love, she did not cry. She had already decided, somewhere deep in the architecture of who she was, that this was not a moment for tears. This was a moment for purpose. Her sister Diane was going to London. And if emptying every room of everything Eleanor owned was the price of that dream, then she would pay it with both hands open and her chin level. The furniture went first. The cream sofa she had saved 3 months to buy, the oak dining table her mother had helped her carry up 2 flights of stairs the year before she passed, and then the electronics. Then the jewelry box her mother had left her, the one with the small ballerina that spun to a music box tune Eleanor had not heard in so long she was afraid she had forgotten it. She sold it all, every piece, every memory with a price tag. And when the last buyer walked out with the last item and the apartment stood hollow and echoing around her, Eleanor Briggs looked at the total in her hand and felt something she could not fully name. Not pride, not grief, but something that lived quietly between the two. She wired every dollar to Diane that same afternoon. "You didn't have to do this," Diane had whispered at the airport, her eyes red, her new luggage gleaming at her feet like a promise. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I did it." But what Eleanor did not know, what she could not have known standing in that departure terminal, squeezing her sister's hands and memorizing her face, was that she was a billionaire's granddaughter. She had no idea that the blood running quiet and steady through her veins carried the weight of a legacy worth more than everything she had ever sold combined. She did not know that somewhere across the country, an old man named Chester Whitfield, founder of Whitfield Global Industries, a man whose name appeared on buildings and endowments and hospital wings, had been searching for her for 11 years. She did not know that her mother, in the final secret she carried to her grave, had been Chester Whitfield's estranged daughter. And she did not know that the letter he had sent, forwarded twice, rerouted once, I finally slipped beneath the door of her now empty apartment, was sitting in the single box she had kept for herself, buried beneath a folded sweater, completely unread. She was unaware, completely, tragically unaware. What she did know was that 6 months after Diane's plane lifted off the runway, she had married Raymond Holt. Raymond had come into her life the way certain storms do, not loudly, not violently, but with a slow, confident pressure that rearranged everything before you realized the weather had changed. He was handsome in the way that required maintenance, charming in the way that required an audience. He had told her she was extraordinary on their third date, and Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime pouring herself into other people's cups. He had not known how thirsty she was until someone finally offered her something to drink. She had believed him, but there were signs she had learned, too late, to read. The way his eyes moved to his phone during dinners, and then moved away too quickly when she glanced over. The business trips that never quite matched the cities he named when he returned. The way his mother, Virginia Holt, a woman built from old money and newer cruelties, had looked at Eleanor at their first meeting with the particular expression of someone who has found something in their home that does not belong there and has not yet decided how to remove it. Eleanor had told herself she was imagining it, but she was not imagining it. She was simply not yet ready to see what she was looking at. Now she was 7 months pregnant, and today was her baby shower. And the church hall had been decorated with pink and white streamers by women who loved her, and someone had baked a lemon cake from scratch. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Briggs sat in a room that was entirely, unreservedly, joyfully hers. She pressed her hand to her belly and felt the baby shift. A slow, rolling movement, like a small tide turning. Outside the hall window, a silver car sat idling at the curb. Raymond stood beside it, his back to the building, his phone pressed to his ear. Beside the car, just barely visible through the frosted glass, a woman in a red coat leaned against the passenger door, watching him speak and smiling. Eleanor could not see her face, but the woman could see Eleanor's silhouette through the window. Glowing, unsuspecting, full of life, and she smiled wider. Who was the woman in the red coat? And why did Raymond's expression, when he finally walked through that door, look nothing like a man arriving at his wife's baby shower? And everything like a man who had already made a decision he had no intention of reversing? Raymond Holt walked through that door like a man who had rehearsed his entrance. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring a gift. He brought only himself. Straightened jacket, cold eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who has already decided how a conversation ends before it begins. The women in the hall noticed him first the way women always notice a shift in atmosphere. Not with their eyes, but with something older, something instinctive. And the laughter in the room dimmed by half a degree before anyone could explain why. Eleanor looked up from the cake table and smiled at her husband. He did not smile back. Raymond. She said his name the way you say the name of something you are still learning not to be afraid of. You came. I came, he said. And then he said nothing else for a moment, just stood there in the doorway of that decorated hall, looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he has grown tired of carrying, and Eleanor felt the first cold thread of something unnamed pull tight in her chest. She would remember this moment for the rest of her life. The lemon cake, the pink streamers, the way the woman nearest to her had quietly set down her cup, the way the room had gone from celebration to courtroom without a single gavel falling. I want a divorce, Raymond said. Loudly, clearly, with the deliberate volume of a man who wanted witnesses. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and texture, the kind you could press your hand against and feel pushing back. Eleanor did not move. Her hand, which had been resting on her belly, stayed exactly where it was, as though some part of her body understood, even before her mind caught up, that the child inside her was the only solid thing left in the room. Raymond, one of her friends began. This doesn't concern you, he said, without looking away from Eleanor. This marriage is over. I've already filed the papers. He reached into his jacket and placed a manila envelope on the nearest table, not in her hands, not with any gesture of private dignity, but on the table, in front of everyone, like a receipt he was done keeping. Eleanor looked at the envelope. Then she looked at her husband, and in his eyes she found no apology, no conflict, no residue of the man who had once told her she was extraordinary. Only the clean, finished look of someone who had already moved on and was now simply completing a formality. You need to leave, he said. The apartment is no longer available to you. Raymond, I'm 7 months pregnant. I know what you are, he said quietly. And those 4 words, the flatness of them, the erasure in them, hit Eleanor somewhere beneath language, beneath argument, in the place where a woman keeps the version of herself she has been most afraid to lose. She did not beg. She would not beg. But her hands were shaking as she picked up the single bag she had brought, the same habit of traveling light she had practiced since the day she sold everything for Diane, and walked toward the door on legs that somehow held her. What she did not know, as she walked out of that hall, was why. Because she would not learn the full truth until later. But the outline of it was this. Raymond had found the small emergency account Eleanor had built over 2 years of careful saving. $4,300. Every cent she had managed to set aside while stretching every paycheck, every dollar, every sacrifice into something that might one day protect her. He had found it, accessed it, and emptied it. Every dollar transferred into an account she had never seen, in a name she did not recognize. The name belonged to a woman called Serena Voss. Serena Voss, who drove a silver car, who wore red coats, who had leaned against Raymond's passenger door outside Eleanor's baby shower and smiled at her silhouette through frosted glass. Raymond had not only given Serena Eleanor's savings, he had used it to pay the first 3 months' rent on a 2-bedroom apartment across the city and written the first check towards Serena's boutique business, the one with the Instagram page that had launched 2 weeks before he served Eleanor divorce papers at her own baby shower. He had funded another woman's future with the money Eleanor had bled to save. But Eleanor did not know any of this yet. What Eleanor knew in that moment was the cold air of the street on her face, the weight of her unborn child, and the address a social worker, called by one of her friends the moment Raymond walked out, read quietly into her ear. The shelter was called Haven House. It had fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, like something alive and tired. It had rows of narrow cots with wool blankets folded at the ends, and a front desk staffed by a woman named Patrice, who asked no questions and passed no judgments and simply handed Eleanor a room key and a small kit of toiletries with the practiced gentleness of someone who had seen too many women arrive this way to pretend there was anything normal about it. Eleanor sat on the edge of her cot that night, both hands on her belly, the thin light above her casting everything in pale gold. In the bag at her feet, the one bag she had carried out of her own baby shower, there was a folded sweater, and beneath the sweater, pressed flat by the weight of everything she had been carrying, was an envelope she had never opened. The return address, printed neatly in the upper left corner, read, Chester Whitfield, Whitfield Global Industries. She did not open it that night. She was too tired to discover anything else that could change her life. But the envelope sat there in the dark, patient, waiting, holding inside it the one truth powerful enough to rewrite everything Raymond Holt had just done to her. And what happened when Eleanor finally opened that letter? What did Chester Whitfield want from the granddaughter he had never met? And where was Serena Voss the night Eleanor Briggs slept in a shelter, while the business Raymond had built for her with stolen money began, quietly, to take shape? 4 months is a long time to rebuild a person from the ground up, but Eleanor Briggs, who had learned long before Haven House and fluorescent lights and wool blankets that survival was simply another word for showing up one more time than the world expected you to, had not spent those 4 months waiting to be rescued. She had spent them becoming something the woman at her baby shower would not have recognized. She had delivered her daughter alone. Well, not entirely alone. Patrice from the front desk had held her hand through 6 hours of labor at County General, squeezing back every time Eleanor squeezed, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. The baby came at 3:17 in the morning, small and furious and perfect. Anna and Eleanor had held her against her chest and felt something ancient and unbreakable settle into place inside her. A kind of quiet that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with decision. She named her Rose, and Rose, from the very first morning, looked at the world the way Eleanor had always wished she could, with wide, unfrightened eyes, as though everything she saw was simply interesting rather than threatening. Eleanor had returned to work 6 weeks after Rose was born, a data entry position she had found through a shelter resource program, remote, modest, enough to begin. She had moved out of Haven House and into a single room she rented from an older woman named Gloria, who charged her below market rate and occasionally left soup outside her door without announcing it. She had not spoken to Raymond, She had not spoken to Diane, who had called twice from London and left voicemails Eleanor had listened to 3 times each without calling back, because she did not yet have the words for what had happened, and she refused to perform grief for an audience, even a loving one. She had not opened the letter, not until the morning the invitation arrived. It came in a cream envelope, heavy paper, embossed seal, the kind of envelope that arrives with the quiet confidence of something that has never been ignored. Inside was a single card, the Whitfield Foundation Annual Charity Gala, an evening of purpose and legacy. Your presence is personally requested, and beneath the printed text, in handwriting that belonged to someone old and deliberate, please come. There is much I should have told you years ago. C.W. Eleanor sat at Gloria's kitchen table for a long time after reading it. Then she went to her bag, found the old envelope beneath the folded sweater where it had waited with the patience of something that knew its moment would come, and she opened it. She read it twice, then a third time. Then she set it flat on the table and pressed both palms against it, as though she needed to feel the paper to believe the words were real. Chester Whitfield was her grandfather. Her mother, quiet, private, sorrowful Margaret Briggs, who had raised 2 daughters alone and died without explaining why, had been born Margaret Whitfield, the only child of Chester Whitfield, before a family rupture so complete and so painful that Margaret had buried the name and never spoken it again. Chester had spent 11 years searching, 11 years of investigators and dead ends and forwarded letters, and he had finally, through a chain of connections Eleanor could not yet fully trace, found her. She wore the only dress she owned that still fit properly, a deep navy wrap dress she had bought secondhand the week she left Haven House, clean and simple and hers. She arranged for Gloria to watch Rose. She took the bus across the city to the Aldrich Hotel, where the Whitfield Foundation Gala was already glittering behind tall glass doors. And she walked in with her chin level and her hands steady and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She did not see Raymond immediately, but she felt the shift in the room the moment he saw her, the way a room adjusts when 2 people with unfinished history enter the same space. While he was standing near the bar with Serena Voss on his arm, Serena in a white dress that cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent, laughing at something with the easy confidence of a woman who has never had to consider the cost of anything because someone else had already paid it. Eleanor looked at them once, then she looked away. She was scanning the room for an elderly man when Virginia Holt found her first. Raymond's mother moved through that gala the way she moved through every room, as though the space had been arranged for her convenience and the people in it existed for her commentary. She was dressed in silver, her hair set in the immovable style of a woman who has not changed anything about herself since 1987, because she has decided without consultation that she was already perfect. She stopped directly in front of Eleanor. "Dear, I didn't expect to see you here," Virginia said, in the tone of someone who has mistaken cruelty for wit for so long that the two have become indistinguishable. "I was invited," Eleanor said. "How interesting." Virginia's eyes moved down Eleanor's dress with the slow, deliberate assessment of someone pricing a second-hand item at a yard sale. "Still wearing that, I see." Eleanor said nothing. She had learned, through 4 months of rebuilding, through labor at 3:17 in the morning, through soup left outside her door by a woman who asked for nothing, that silence, deployed correctly, was louder than anything she could say. It was Serena who laughed first, a bright, performative laugh from across the room, sharp enough to turn heads. And it was Virginia who moved, so quickly, so deliberately, in that Eleanor had no time to step back, lifting the glass of dirty, floral arrangement water she had been carrying from a nearby centerpiece vase, and pouring it over Eleanor's head, down her dress, across her shoulders, in front of everyone. The room went silent. Eleanor stood completely still. The water ran cold down the back of her neck. Her navy dress darkened at the shoulders. Across the room, Serena covered her mouth, but not her eyes, which were bright with a pleasure she did not bother to disguise. And then from the far end of the room, a voice, old, steady, and carrying the particular authority of someone who has not raised his voice in years because he has never needed to, cut through the silence like something final. That woman, Chester Whitfield said, walking forward with his cane, his eyes fixed on Eleanor with an expression that stopped every conversation in the room, is my granddaughter. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Virginia Holt's silver glass slipped from her fingers and struck the marble floor, and the sound it made was the only sound in the room. Eleanor turned to face the old man walking toward her, the grandfather she had never met, whose letter she had only just read, whose name was on the building they were standing in. And for the first time in 4 months, her chin was not level. Her eyes filled, just once, just for a moment. But what did Chester Whitfield do next? In front of Raymond, in front of Virginia, in front of Serena and every witness in that room? And now that the billionaire's granddaughter had finally been seen, what happened to the man who had stolen her money? He'd divorced her at her own baby shower and left her in a shelter with his child. Chester Whitfield had built an empire on one principle, that the truth, no matter how long it was buried, always finds its way to the surface. He had watched it happen in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in the quiet collapse of partnerships built on deception. He had seen it so many times across so many decades that he had stopped being surprised by it. But standing in the middle of the Aldridge Hotel ballroom, looking at his granddaughter with dirty water running down her dress, Chester Whitfield felt something he had not felt in 11 years of searching. He felt fury, not the loud combustible kind, the old compressed kind, the kind that has been waiting so long it has calcified into something harder than anger and more permanent than rage. He walked toward Eleanor with the steady and unhurried pace of a man who has never needed to run toward anything because everything has always, eventually come to terms with him. And when he reached her, he did something nobody in that room expected. He took off his jacket, his perfectly tailored charcoal gray jacket, and placed it around Eleanor's shoulders, gently, the way a person handles something they have been searching for and are afraid even now of breaking. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. "I'm sorry it took me this long to find you." Eleanor looked at him, this old man with her mother's eyes and her mother's stillness, and said nothing, but she did not pull away. Chester turned to face the room, and the room, which had been holding its collective breath, went even quieter. My name is Chester Whitfield," he said, though of course everyone already knew. "And the woman standing beside me is Eleanor Briggs, my daughter Margaret's child and my sole living heir." He let that sentence settle the way a stone settles in still water, completely with widening rings. Eleanor will be formally recognized as a Whitfield beneficiary, effective immediately, with full access to the Whitfield family trust. He paused. "I am also instructing my legal team, beginning tomorrow morning, to conduct a full audit of all financial accounts connected to Eleanor's former marriage, as I have reason to believe certain funds were misappropriated." The word misappropriated landed in the room like something with edges. Raymond Holt, Mike, who had been standing at the bar with the expression of a man watching a building fall in a direction he had not calculated, set down his glass with a hand that was no longer entirely steady. Serena Voss, beside him, had stopped smiling. The white dress that had cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent suddenly looked less like confidence and more like a costume. And Serena, who had built her boutique on the first 3 months of rent Raymond had paid with stolen money, seemed to understand, in the way people understand things when consequences finally enter the room, that the audit Chester Whitfield had just announced would not stop at Eleanor's accounts. It would find everything, and it did. Within 72 hours, Chester's legal team had reconstructed the full picture. Every transfer, every timestamp, and every dollar that had moved from Eleanor's savings into Raymond's secondary account and then onward into Serena's business and the apartment Raymond had rented for her across the city. $4,300. Every cent Eleanor had bled to save while 7 months pregnant. The documentation was clean, precise, and devastating. The kind of financial evidence that does not leave room for alternative interpretations. Raymond's employer was notified. His professional licenses were reviewed. The apartment Serena had been living in, paid for with Eleanor's money, was subject to civil recovery proceedings. Serena's boutique, which had launched on the back of funds that did not belong to her, faced its own legal complications that her Instagram following could not resolve. But the detail that finished Raymond, the one that left him standing outside Chester Whitfield's legal offices on a Tuesday morning with no words and no plan and no version of events that helped him, was not the audit. It was Rose. Chester's attorneys had filed on Eleanor's behalf a full child support and asset disclosure claim. Raymond, who had divorced Eleanor with the confidence of a man discarding something worthless, now faced the financial and legal obligations of a man who had abandoned a billionaire's granddaughter's child, and the court, presented with the evidence of his conduct, was not sympathetic. He had thrown away a woman he believed had nothing, but she had never had nothing. She had simply been unaware of everything she carried. Eleanor, for her part, did not attend any of the legal proceedings. She did not need to. She was busy. Chester had arranged temporary accommodation in a Whitfield family property, a townhouse, warm and quiet, with a garden that caught the afternoon light and a nursery that Eleanor furnished slowly and deliberately, one piece at a time, the way she had always done things. She returned to Gloria's twice, once to pay 3 months of rent in advance as a gift, and once simply to visit, because Gloria had left soup outside her door, and that was not the kind of thing Eleanor Briggs forgot. She called Diane. Her sister answered on the first ring from London, which told Eleanor that Diane had been waiting perhaps since the first unanswered voicemail. And the conversation that followed was long and honest and painful in the way that only conversations between people who truly love each other can be. Diane wept. She apologized, not for going to London, but for not coming back sooner, for not reading the silence in Eleanor's unanswered calls correctly, for letting her own new life muffle the sound of her sister's. But Diane also carried news of her own. In London, through a connection she could not have predicted and had not sought, Diane had encountered a woman who recognized Eleanor's name. A retired private investigator who had worked for Chester Whitfield years earlier and had come closer than anyone to finding Margaret Whitfield's daughters before the trail went cold. The investigator had kept her files, and inside those files was something that changed the shape of the entire story. Evidence that the family rupture between Margaret and Chester had not been organic. It had been engineered. Someone had deliberately fed Chester false information about Margaret's whereabouts for years, keeping father and daughter separated, keeping Eleanor and Diane hidden. That someone was connected to a branch of the Whitfield family that stood to inherit everything if Chester died without a direct heir. Chester, when Eleanor brought him this information on a quiet Thursday afternoon in his study, sat very still for a long time. "Your mother knew," he said finally. "She knew someone was keeping us apart, but she couldn't prove it, and she didn't want to put you girls in the middle of it." He looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man assembling, piece by piece, a grief he had been carrying in fragments. "She protected you the only way she knew how, by disappearing completely." Eleanor thought about her mother, quiet, private, sorrowful Margaret Briggs, who had raised 2 daughters alone and died without explaining why. She thought about the music box with the spinning ballerina that she had sold to send Diane to London. She thought about the letter that had sat unopened in a box beneath a folded sweater while she slept on a cot in Haven House. She thought about Rose, asleep right now in a nursery with afternoon light coming through the curtains, and she understood, finally and completely, that her mother had not been broken. Her mother had been brave, in the quiet, costly, unwitnessed way that only the strongest people are brave. Margaret had given up everything, her name, her inheritance, her father, to keep her daughters safe from a fight that was not theirs to fight. And Eleanor, without knowing it, Cherie had inherited that exact bravery and spent her entire life practicing it without understanding where it came from. She had sold everything for Diane. She had walked out of her own baby shower with her chin level. She had slept in a shelter and named her daughter Rose and shown up one more time than the world expected her to. She was her mother's daughter. She had always been her mother's daughter. Raymond came, eventually. Of course he came. Men like Raymond always come, not when they should, but when they have no other direction left to move. He appeared at the townhouse gate on a gray Saturday morning, thinner than she remembered, his confidence restructured by consequence into something that looked almost like humility, but was not quite there yet. Eleanor saw him from the upstairs window. She stood there for a moment, Rose on her hip, The morning light coming through the glass, Chester's jacket still hanging on the chair in the corner where she had placed it the night of the gala. And she felt nothing violent. No rage, no longing, nothing with edges. What she felt was clear. She did not go downstairs. She asked Gloria, who had moved into the townhouse guest room 3 weeks earlier, because Eleanor had asked and Gloria had said yes with the swiftness of someone who had been hoping to be asked, to tell the man at the gate that Mrs. Briggs was unavailable. Not Mrs. Holt, Mrs. Briggs. Raymond stood at that gate for 11 minutes. Eleanor watched the clock. Then he turned and walked back to a car that was smaller than the one he used to drive. Oh, and he did not look back, because there was nothing behind him anymore worth looking at. Serena Voss did not come. Serena had, by all accounts, moved to another city and was in the process of rebranding, which Eleanor thought was the most honest thing Serena had ever done. On the first Sunday of the following month, Chester Whitfield held a small private gathering at the townhouse. Not a gala, not an event, just people who mattered, sitting in the garden in the afternoon light. Diane had flown in from London. Gloria was there. Patrice from Haven House came, because Eleanor had sent a car for her, because some debts are not financial and must be honored differently. Chester sat beside Eleanor with Rose on his knee, the baby gripping his finger with her whole fist, and he laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded. Wouldn't the kind a man produces when something he stopped believing in suddenly turns out to be true. "She has your mother's hands," he said. "I know," Eleanor said, and she smiled, not the careful, chin-level smile she had taught herself to wear as armor, but the real one, the one that had been waiting behind everything else for a moment safe enough to show itself. She had been unaware. She had sold everything. She had been dumped in a shelter at her own baby shower by a husband who thought she was worthless, humiliated at a gala by a woman who thought cruelty was power, and robbed by a man who thought her savings were his to spend on another woman's future. But she had Rose. She had Chester. She had Diane flying back. She had Gloria's soup in Patrice's hand and a townhouse with afternoon light coming through the curtains. And she had, finally, her mother's name. Margaret Whitfield had disappeared to protect her daughters from a fight that was not theirs. But Eleanor Briggs, Eleanor Whitfield, had walked straight into that fight without even knowing it was happening, and she had won. Not loudly, not violently. The way her mother had taught her, by showing up one more time than the world expected, with her chin level and her hands open and everything she was laid bare and unashamed. That was enough. It had always been enough. And perhaps that is the truest thing this story has to say, that the woman the world overlooks is very often the woman the world is not yet ready for. Dear viewers, this story was written for you, because somewhere in Eleanor's journey, there is a truth you may have needed to hear today. Life will sometimes strip you of everything, your comfort, your dignity, your sense of who you are, but it cannot strip you of what you are made of. Eleanor never stopped giving, never stopped showing up, and never stopped being exactly who she was, even when who she was seemed to count for nothing. That is the lesson. Your value is not determined by who abandons you, humiliates you, or steals from you. It is revealed by what you do in the shelter, in the quiet, unglamorous, unseen moments when nobody is watching, and you choose one more time to keep going. Now tell me, what lesson did this story teach you? And if you were Eleanor, would you have forgiven Raymond or walked away forever? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if stories like this, stories that entertain, move, and then teach, are what you come here for, then subscribe because there is so much more where this came from.